With the IEB matric results out, the country is anxiously waiting to hear how students at public schools have fared. At just over 98%, the pass rate for the IEB exams is slightly higher than the previous year. The vast majority of grade 12 learners in South Africa set for the National Senior Certificate exams and will compete compete with their peers from private schools for a place at institutions of higher learning. But is the South African school curriculum on track to prepare learners for a changing and increasingly digitized world? Let's unpack this for you now. Former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla is our guest. He joins us via our video link. And Dr. Lehohla, it's great to have you on the program as always. Let's first reflect on the journey so far. 28 years after democracy, in what ways, if any, do you feel that the country's education system still fails its learners?
Well, I think it's good that it's 28 years since a child born in 1994 would be 28 years today as a young person, or yes, a young adult. In that period, such a child would have been born with a cohort of 1 million. And that million is the number of births that we see in South Africa year in, year out. Of those million born, 600,000 of them do not get basic education. And that is basic education as acquiring basic education, which is matric. 600,000 of those don't. 150,000 of them, when they write matric, or rather, out of the 500,000 that write matric, 150,000 of them will get exemption, which means they can enter university and the like. So we are very wasteful, by the way, that only 150,000 out of 1 million people born every year will actually achieve a matric certificate that is meaningful. So this is what we have been turning all the time, year in, year out, in the 28 years. So the levels of unemployment that we see, which are reaching proportions that are unacceptable, are actually manufactured by our policies. And we are in that space at the moment, and with things like the pandemic, the financial crisis, and so on, we have created this situation that is untenable. And these things that find us underprepared is not a matter of luck, it's a matter of not preparing well for the future, our children and so on. So these are man-made.
Right. What you're alluding to is what some people have termed the throughput rate in the education system. In fact, for as long as I can remember, there have been calls for the minister, as she announces those broad take numbers later today, includes this figure in that announcement. I mean, as far as you're concerned...
That must be our denominator. Our denominator should not be those that are writing. Of course, it's important to have those that are writing. But the overall denominator is our commitment to ensuring that every child in South Africa achieves a basic education. And if 600,000 already do not, and then out of the 500,000 that will write, only 150,000 will get exemption. Of course, that number has increased somewhat to about 200,000 now. But the bulk, over a period of time, sustained period of time, this thing was around 150,000. It doesn't augur well for any country.
Yeah, of course, that will be...
So when you start looking at progression ratios of people that finally have higher education, which is degrees and the like, amongst the blacks, the proportion of adults that get to that is very, very, very extremely low. I mean, it's about 6%. Amongst whites, when you look at the overall pyramid, it is almost equivalent to that of Korea, and Korea has the highest proportion of people with degrees, and that's what the white population has, of course, historically prepared for itself. That kind of outcome, and has sustained that in the current. And that's what you see in the time plots that our censuses produce. So, but that number is too small to make South Africa a winning nation. I mean, the number of white although they are a Korea kind of standard, they are too few to change the dial for South Africa.
Sure. It's difficult not to also be making comparisons between how the IEB students are performing versus their counterparts in public schools. Despite the challenges that this particular cohort has experienced because of things like the pandemic, they've actually managed to improve their overall outcome. Needless to say, we're expecting a far cry from that when Anju Motshekga gives the final pass rate for the country later today. Are we spending enough time speaking about this disparity?
Well, I mean, IB is 12,000 students year in, year out. I mean, it's a drop in an ocean. Well, they are doing well, and of course, they are paying very high fees, 300,000, 200,000 for matric, year in, year out by parents. Well, choices, one may say, markets, one may say. But overall, for impact in South Africa, that's nothing. We haven't started. We are cheering for an illusion, so to say. So I have a very dim view around private markets in education. In fact, it creates difficulties for the country, and we are not focusing on providing education. I mean, if you look at Miri in Limpopo, in Venda, they pay the same. I mean, they achieve the same results as IEB results, and the subsidy is 1,100 per child, and then parents top up maybe with another 1,000. For 2,200 rand or 3,000 rand, that is the overall expense on the education of a child in Biri. They get the same results as the results of a 300,000 school. Now, the question is, why is it difficult to scale at 3,000 rand like Mbiri is doing? So there is a lot that we have to do. I mean, it starts with the home. I mean, when Minister Motshekga receives these children at school at age 6, the goods are already seriously damaged. I mean, we have 60% of fathers claiming 60% of fathers saying that they are married against the 33% of mothers that are saying they are married. That level of dysfunction in society tells you that we are deeply in trouble, because whatever it is, the children are growing up schizophrenic as to who has to be responsible for them in those kinds of proportions. And our policymakers don't pay attention to this particular statistic.
Right.
And it's not a statistics, it's a lived experience, and understanding that lived experience has to inform our design of education systems.
Sure.
It doesn't look like we pay attention to that.
It's certainly not the kind of issue that the Education Department can fix alone. But you mentioned the issue of markets in education, which I find quite interesting, because a lot of parents who are opting to take their children to private learning institutions speak of this idea of ROI, right? The return of investment on the money you put in. The numbers on the face of it appear to suggest that the ROI in the private sector is higher than what you'd receive in the public sector. I wonder how accurate that perception is.
Well, I mean, the pass rate is very high, 98%, yeah. 98.9%. Almost you are guaranteed that your child will do well. But 12,000, my goodness, out of 1 million children, what's that? I mean, we really cannot waste our breath on that, because it's illusory. What we have to be thinking about is how, as a nation, we can push 1 million children to actually achieve basic education in the country.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the curricula as structured now by the minister, which provides all kinds of art, technical education and so on, it's part of the solution in terms of opening the minds of children. But they must still achieve basic education. It can't be that they exit. It cannot be a strategy for ensuring that when they exit and they don't achieve basic education, they have a skill. It must be that part and parcel of basic education is achieving the skill. So the 10-year education should still be mandatory so that people achieve a basic education, but with a skill. rather than saying as they drop out, they may have a skill. No, it must be they achieve that embedded in it with a skill. And so for universal technical education at the basic education level, it's very, very important as a component in agriculture, in carpentry, and so on, in bricklaying, and so on. And in addition to mathematics, because you see mathematics in action when you do those kinds of things. You see life in action when you do farming. So biology becomes part and parcel of real experience that you see in a classroom and in field. So those things are important to do. And I think that curricula is that. But the positioning of it must not be so that when they drop out they have a skill, but it must be as they complete their basic education, they have a skill.
Sure. It sounds like the kind of thing the basic education department will be able to achieve in a context where they're well capacitated. Are we able to have that?
Well, they're well capacitated. I mean, if you look at the budget spent on education, there is enough money.
Yeah, but I mean, is the money being spent where it should be is the question, right? I mean, a lot of the times, especially around the budget, we speak about how much goes to education. But is the money being spent, especially when you look at the outcomes within that department?
No, it's not. I mean, I made a Minister Msecha then when I was still Statistician-General invited me to a meeting in the Free State when she was starting to look at education. And I made a presentation to say, well, here are the outcomes. And there was, of course, the trade unions, the teachers, and everybody. When after presenting that and saying, look, this is what we are collectively producing as a nation. In fact, children leave Soweto to go to suburbs to try and get better education. And that's the driver of unemployment for black teachers, by the way. Unless we make black societies functional, and being functional, it means they must attract their children to the schools that they must. It can't be that a teacher sends his children to Model C schools, and therefore we guarantee white permanent jobs in education. I mean, this whole thing fails the rainbow, the construct, and the notion of a rainbow nation. And if we don't pay attention to all these aspects, the rainbow nation will just be, the ray. So the ray from the rainbow nation, as one of the columnists put it, will be out, and it has been removed all the time for the last 28 years.
Sure. Sobering reflections there. Thanks for your insight. Really appreciate your time this morning. Dr. Pali Lehohla is the former Statistician-General. Once again, thanks very much indeed.